On November 2007, British student Meredith Kercher was murdered in Perugia, Italy. The case quickly became international news, especially after investigators focused on Amanda Knox, Kercher's American roommate, and Rafael Solicito, Knox's boyfriend. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on DNA evidence. Two pieces became especially important: a kitchen knife and a bra clasp. The knife was recovered from Solicito's apartment. Investigators said Amanda Knox's DNA was on the handle and Meredith Kercher's DNA was on the blade. The bra clasp was found in Kercher's room and was said to contain DNA linked to Solicito. At first, this sounded powerful. But later, the DNA evidence came under serious attack. Independent experts questioned the reliability of the knife evidence, especially because the alleged DNA trace on the blade was very small. They also raised concerns about contamination and whether the testing met proper standards. The bra clasp became even more controversial because it was not collected until weeks after the murder. During that time, it had been left in the room, moved, and exposed to possible contamination. Forensic evidence that should have clarified the case instead created confusion. Knox and Solicito were convicted in 2009, acquitted on appeal in 2011, convicted again in 2014, and finally acquitted by Italy's highest court in 2015. The case became a global example of how DNA evidence can be misunderstood. Many people think DNA is always perfect, but DNA is only as reliable as the way it is collected, stored, tested, and interpreted. If a sample is tiny, contaminated, delayed, or poorly documented, it can become dangerous. It can look scientific while still being misleading. Amanda Knox spent years under global suspicion and legal pressure. Meredith Kercher's family also suffered through years of uncertainty and repeated trials. The real tragedy is that evidence mistakes did not bring peace. They made the case more confusing, more public, and more painful for everyone involved. This case proved that even modern forensic science can damage justice if the process behind it is weak. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were murdered in Los Angeles. The trial of O.J. Simpson became one of the most watched criminal trials in history. Millions followed every moment on television. The prosecution had physical evidence, DNA evidence, blood evidence, and a story they believed pointed to Simpson. But one courtroom moment changed the public memory of the entire case. On June 15, 1995, prosecutor Christopher Darden asked Simpson to try on a pair of leather gloves connected to the murders. One glove had been found at the crime scene and another near Simpson's home. It was a risky move. If the gloves fit clearly, it could strengthen the prosecution's case. But if they did not fit, it could create a powerful image of doubt. Simpson stood in court and struggled to pull the gloves over his hands. They appeared too small. The defense immediately understood the power of the moment. Later, Johnny Cochran delivered the famous line, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." That sentence became one of the most famous phrases in courtroom history. The glove problem did not automatically prove Simpson was innocent. There were possible explanations. The gloves may have shrunk, Simpson wore latex gloves underneath, and leather can change after blood exposure and handling. But trials are not only about evidence. They are also about how evidence looks to a jury. The glove demonstration turned a piece of physical evidence into a symbol of reasonable doubt. Instead of helping the prosecution, it helped the defense attack the state's case. The Simpson trial also had other evidence problems, including attacks on LAPD handling procedures, chain of custody questions, and the credibility of Detective Mark Furman. On October 3, 1995, O.J. Simpson was acquitted in the criminal trial. This case shows how evidence can be damaged not only in a lab or at a crime scene, but also in the courtroom. A single demonstration done at the wrong time and under the wrong conditions can change how millions of people understand a case. The glove was supposed to be proof. Instead, it became doubt. On April 19, 1989, a young woman was brutally attacked while jogging in Central Park, New York City. The crime shocked the city. Police were under intense pressure to find suspects quickly. That same night, several teenagers were picked up in the park. 5 of them, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise would become known as the Central Park Five. They were only teenagers. After hours of intense interrogation, they gave statements that appeared to connect them to the crime. But those confessions had major problems. They were inconsistent. The details did not match each other. Some parts did not match the physical evidence. There was also a major evidence issue. The DNA evidence did not match any of the five teenagers. But instead of treating that as a serious warning sign, the case moved forward. The confessions became stronger in the courtroom than the missing physical evidence. The public had already been told a story, and the media repeated it aggressively. The boys were presented as violent criminals before the evidence had been properly tested in the public mind. In 1990, the five teenagers were convicted. They spent years in prison. Corey Wise spent the longest time behind bars, around 13 years. The others also lost important years of their youth. Their names, families, reputations, and futures were damaged. Then, in 2002, a convicted murderer and serial rapist named Matias Reyes confessed that he alone had attacked the jogger. DNA evidence matched Reyes and confirmed his connection to the crime scene. The convictions of the five men were vacated. This case was not just about one evidence mistake. It was about the system giving more weight to pressured confessions than to physical evidence that did not fit the story. When evidence does not match a confession, investigators must slow down. But in this case, pressure moved faster than truth. The Central Park Five case became a warning about false confessions, youth interrogations, media pressure, and the danger of ignoring DNA evidence when it points away from the accused. The truth was there. The system just refused to listen in time. On August 13, 1986, Christine Morton was murdered in her home in Williamson County, Texas. Her husband, Michael Morton, quickly became the main suspect. Investigators believed he had killed his wife after an argument, but there was evidence that pointed away from him, evidence that should have changed the entire direction of the case. One of the most important details came from the Mortons' young son, who reportedly indicated that his father was not home when the attack happened. There were also leads about a suspicious man and a green van near the area. Later, evidence connected to the crime scene would become critical. But instead of being fully disclosed and explored, important exculpatory information was withheld or ignored. That was the evidence mistake that destroyed the case. Michael Morton was convicted on February 17, 1987, and sentenced to life in prison. For nearly 25 years, he remained behind bars for a murder he did not commit. The tragedy was not only that Morton was innocent, it was that the real killer remained free. During that time, another woman, Deborah Baker, was murdered in a similar way. Years later, DNA testing on a bloody bandana connected the crime to another man, Mark Allen Norwood. The new evidence helped prove what Morton had said all along. He did not kill his wife. Michael Morton was released on October 4, 2011, and officially exonerated on December 19, 2011. His case became a major example of why prosecutors must disclose evidence that helps the defense. When evidence is hidden, the trial is no longer a fair search for truth. It becomes a one-sided story. Morton lost nearly 25 years. He lost his marriage, his son's childhood, and a life that could never be fully restored. The evidence did not fail because science was impossible. It failed because the truth was not fully shown. And that mistake destroyed more than one life. On June 17, 1966, a triple shooting took place at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey. 3 people were killed or later died from their injuries, and the case quickly became one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. Police soon focused on Reuben "Hurricane" Carter, a professional boxer, and John Ardis, a young man who was with him that night. Carter was famous, outspoken, and already known to police. That made him an easy target for suspicion. But suspicion is not evidence. The physical evidence against Carter and Ardis was weak. The case relied heavily on witness statements, especially from people whose credibility later became a major issue. Some witnesses changed their stories, some had criminal problems of their own. And over time, questions grew about whether the investigation had focused on building a case against Carter instead of testing the evidence fairly. Carter and Ardis were convicted in 1967 and sentenced to life in prison. For Carter, the damage was immediate. His boxing career collapsed. His public image changed from athlete to convicted murderer. For years, he fought not only prison walls, but also the belief that the system had already decided who he was. The case did not end there. After appeals, publicity, and growing doubts, Carter and Artis were tried again in 1976. They were convicted again. But the evidence problems refused to disappear. Years later, a federal judge reviewed the case and overturned the convictions in 1985. The judge criticized the way the prosecution had handled the case, including constitutional problems and hidden evidence issues. In 1988, prosecutors finally dropped the charges. Carter had spent almost 2 decades in prison. This case shows that evidence is not only about what is found at a crime scene. It is also about what investigators choose to believe, what prosecutors disclose, and whether witness statements are tested carefully. When weak evidence is treated like certainty, a courtroom can turn into a trap. Reuben Carter eventually walked free, but he never got back the years the evidence mistakes had taken from him. On July 29, 1985, a woman was attacked near Lake Michigan in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. Police soon focused on Stephen Avery. The victim identified Avery as the attacker, and that identification became the center of the case. But there was a serious problem. Eyewitness identification can be wrong, especially when the process used by investigators increases pressure or suggestion. Avery had alibi witnesses who said he was somewhere else at the time, but the investigation continued to move against him. The case also included forensic evidence that was weaker than it appeared. Hair comparison evidence was used at trial, but this type of evidence has been criticized in many wrongful conviction cases because it can sound more certain than it really is. In 1985, Avery was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. For 18 years, Avery lived with the result of a mistaken case. He lost freedom, family time, reputation, and the chance to build a normal life. He continued saying he was innocent, but the evidence used against him had already convinced the court. Then, DNA testing changed everything. In 2003, DNA testing excluded Avery as the source of the biological evidence from the crime. The DNA pointed to another man, someone who had later been convicted of another sexual assault. That meant the evidence had not only failed Stephen Avery, it had also allowed the real attacker to remain free. Avery was released after serving 18 years. This story is important because it is only about his 1985 wrongful conviction. Years later, Avery became involved in a separate murder case, which is legally different and controversial. But the 1985 case is a clear example of how evidence mistakes can destroy a life. The mistake was not one single object. It was a chain of errors: overconfidence in eyewitness identification, weak forensic interpretation, and failure to give enough weight to alibi evidence. When investigators decide too early that they have the right suspect, every piece of evidence can start being forced into the same story. And for Stephen Avery, that story cost 18 years.